Welcome to Poor Millionaires. Today's guest is Andrew Brown of E72 Dynasty Trust. Andrew is an expert in family dynasties and publicly listed majority-owned family businesses. In today's pod, we're going to learn how 3 of the most successful European family dynasties invest, but crucially, how you can also apply these principles in managing your own wealth. Poor Millionaires is a show for people with investable wealth of $1 to $20 million. We strive to educate, connect, and inspire, to give you the tools you need to thrive and secure lasting prosperity for yourself and for your family. PoorMillionaires.com. Invest with ambition. This podcast is for educational purposes only. The information does not constitute financial advice or recommendation and should not be considered as such. Value investments and any income derived from them can fall as well as rise, and you may not get back the original amount you invested. Welcome to the show, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our guest, Andrew Brown of E72 Dynasty Trust.
G'day, James. Nice to be here.
Good to have you here, Andrew. So Andrew and I met in Texas last month at Keith Blackboard's Passive Investor event, and Andrew gave a brilliant presentation there on family dynasties and how they operate. And I just knew at that point that I had to get Andrew on the podcast to share his insights with everybody. So, Andrew, just tell us a little bit about how you became interested in family dynasties and specifically their investment vehicles, and also why you're ideally placed to talk about them.
Absolutely, James. Thanks for the compliment, by the way. That's good. Look, many years ago, when I was still at school, in sixth form, I studied economics like a lot of other people do, and we did the stock exchange and what it was all about, and we had a stock picking competition, and I happened to win it, which might be no surprise, but I won it with a family dynasty conglomerate. Which is very familiar if you're of a certain age in the UK, because it's called Thomson Organisation. It's still a listed company in Canada called Thomson Reuters.
Yeah.
But at that stage, before the Reuters bit came along, it was Britain's largest package holiday company. And because it did package holidays, it had its own airline. It used to own the Times newspaper. And it also had North Sea oil interests. So you can imagine for a kid in the late 1970s, what's better, to have your own newspaper, oil wells, jets, and a holiday company. So happened to win with that one. And it sort of really piqued my interest as to, what these kind of companies were about. More seriously, I have worked for, the ultimate family dynasty, which is Rothschild. Who obviously in both the UK and France, they're into about their 8th generation in the UK and about the 6th in France. And that was, just remarkable people to work for. So I work for them here in Australia. I run a fund, the E72 Dynasty Trust, which invests in companies which are controlled, not necessarily by families, but mainly by families. So most of the holdings I've got a family control group that actually run them. And what that makes you do is the first thing you look at is not necessarily the company and its profit and loss accounts and all that sort of stuff, because that can be fantastic. But obviously some families are not very good at dealing with outside shareholders in public companies. So the first thing you've got to do is to actually research the controller, rather than the company, and actually understand what is the family, if it's a family controlled entity, what are they actually all about? Bluntly, are they going to steal the money? The usual problem is that they don't steal the money, but they don't let the sort of dividends or the capital growth flow to the minority shareholders. And that sort of gives you a real problem, because it becomes what I call a value trap. And you can't, there's nothing you can do because they're the controllers. You can't call meetings to try and get rid of them because you're going to lose every time. So you've got to do that homework first to say, yes, I trust this group of people based on their past track record and what I know about them. And the big difference in what I'm looking at versus maybe what people are very, very familiar with today is that the companies I invest in, the families are usually multi-generational. So, we're all aware that, some of the biggest companies in the world are controlled by a small number of individuals. Uh, the biggest company in the world that fits that bill is, of course, Alphabet or Google, which is still controlled by Sergey Brin and Larry Page. And then Meta is still controlled by Mark Zuckerberg. Tesla is obviously controlled by Elon Musk, and perhaps up until today, Berkshire Hathaway by Warren Buffett. But they're largely single generation companies. This is the first generation of people. And so, whilst you can clearly learn things from studying Alphabet in particular, you can't learn about what it's like to be multi generational because they haven't really got to that stage yet. So, whereas I'm going to mention three dynasties today, and the shortest lived of them is 5 generations, and we're up to 8 in one case.
So a couple of things, Andrew. Is the E72 Dynasty Trust, is that accessible just by institutional investors, or can private investors access that vehicle? And also, for the record, I just want to say that although Andrew speaks with an Australian accent, he is actually a northerner because he hails from Scunthorpe in the north of England.
Absolutely right. Keep your eye on the National League as well, because we're getting out of it this year, I hope, and back into League Two. That's right. Yes, the East 72 Dynasty Trust is accessible to what Americans would call accredited investors, what we call wholesale investors in Australia, and there's various different terms for them around the world. So the minimum investment's 50,000 Australian dollars, and you have to be, I'll just use the term accredited. So it's accessible to a lot of people, yes.
Right. So what makes these types of companies interesting to investors? Because the whole kind of conglomerate sort of thing that kind of flies in the face of modern financial theory, doesn't it? Because these days, these companies tend to be broken up and they tend to be valued more. They tend to be more highly valued if they're separate entities, essentially. So what makes these types of companies of interest to investors?
Well, the first thing is not all of them are conglomerates. A company, and I should add, virtually every company I'm going to mention in this, we have a shareholding in. So please be aware of the fact that there is a conflict of interest in what I'm talking about in many of these companies. One of the bigger companies in our fund is a company called Avolta, which is a Swiss company, and they're basically the largest airport retail business in the world. Across duty free, across convenience retail, and across food and beverage. So that's a very, very focused business. Whereas clearly, as you rightly say, James, there are others that are conglomerates. What makes them interesting is that they do reflect, if they're properly run, and I do stress that because there are some family controlled companies that are not properly run, okay, which obviously we try to screen out. I won't put any names to them for fear of being sued, and they've got more money than I have. But some of them don't manage capital very well. Whereas the good ones, of course, they've got this ownership ethos. And there's lots and lots of studies, most recently a brilliant one by a company called Greenwood Investors, which shows that companies that are focused around ownership outperform companies that are sort of run by agent or managers, by, in many cases, over the long term. And I stress those words, over the long term. They create multiples of the investment return that a standard managed type of company would do, where there's, if you will, a conflict of interest on remuneration. So it's the ownership ethic that really makes many of these companies tick. And so that's a really good starting point. Secondly, it's an extension of what a lot of people have started to get into in the last few years, which is founder-led businesses. And founder-led businesses are like some of the ones I've mentioned, the Metas, the Amazons, the Alphabets. But as I say, they're all single generations at the moment, really, and you don't know what's going to happen down the track. Whereas the kind of ones I look at, we know what's happening because the family have passed on to the next generation and the next and the next. So it's really an extension of a concept that a lot of fund managers have certainly got into and have one or two have actually set up funds where they focus on founder-led businesses. The third thing is that what makes them interesting is that when you start picking through them, there are amazing numbers of common traits about them. Even if they're quite different families in quite different countries, there are some very, very common traits that mark out why some of them have been really, really successful over decades, not just a few years, but over decades and decades and decades. And of course, that means there are some distinct traits about the ones that are very disappointing over decades and decades and decades as well. And so, we'll touch on some of the common traits of what makes these things really, really tick. And I believe that, there are real lessons there for people as well. And so obviously we're going to touch on that.
And what about their particular relevance for our audience then? Because we're talking about the poor millionaires with assets between $1 and $20 million.
Yep.
What can we learn from these family dynasties that's relevant to this group of investors? Do you think?
Absolutely heaps. I think the first thing is if you've got to remember many of these things, they're almost like publicly listed family offices. You're parking your investment directly alongside this very, very wealthy family. And so, it's as though they've invited you in to be part of their family office. And, in many cases, you certainly wouldn't turn that down if you were given the opportunity. These things happen to be publicly listed. And in many cases, they trade at very significant discounts to what the net asset values are. In some cases, that's thoroughly justified, in others, far less. So, what you can learn is the first thing is if you're trying to set up a kind of mini family office or even a quite large family office, you can learn from the people who've been doing it for decades. So, there's direct lessons there for you. The second thing is some people do and some people don't. But if you want to set up a sort of dynasty, if you will, for your kids, if you've done very well, if you've built a business which you may have then sold and you're now into investing and trying to preserve and grow that wealth that you've created, but you want to involve your kids, then there's brilliant lessons from analysing these kind of companies. And in particular, if your kids are of such an age, where they can do that, understand it, have the time to do it, then you can learn the lessons in tandem with your kids to make sure your kids understand, what the whole idea of building a multi-generational family investment company is all about. And thirdly, it's also obviously if you don't want to do any of those kind of higher goals, it is also about building a long-standing, long-term income stream, in an asset holding vehicle of some description, whatever's appropriate for your tax jurisdiction, and learn some of the lessons about that, and why. What you can learn from these companies of do's and don'ts in terms of just setting up something as simple as that. So it's really, I think there's great all-round lessons irrespective of whether you're taking your sort of, 2 to 20 million and trying to make a dynasty, trying to make a family office, or just saying, hey, we just want to be comfortable for the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Great. So we're going to pick into some of the family dynasties now. And I don't think any of these families are household names as such, but this first one might be familiar to some people through its association with the automobile industry. So what can we learn from the Agnelli family?
Well, what you can learn from the Agnelli family, they're very much actually in the news as we record this, because the Agnelli family founded Fiat in 1899. And of course, since the 1960s, Fiat has controlled Ferrari. And you're obviously well aware Ferrari has a Formula One motor racing team. And the current patriarch of the dynasty is John Elkann. I'll explain how come he's called Elkann and not Agnelli in a second. But Mr. Elkann was rather critical of his two drivers on the weekend. By association, because he praised the mechanics and the garage crew, and wondered why the team's not winning at the moment, and that might be due to Monsieur Leclerc and Mr. Hamilton. So he's not real popular amongst people right now. So just a brief rundown. The Agnelli family, as I say, Fiat was started by Giovanni Agnelli in 1899. If you don't know, Fiat stands for Fabbrica Italiano Automobili Torino, so it's based in Turin. He made money out of that, started diversifying in the 1920s, setting up investment companies. He jumped a generation, and his grandson, who was also called Giovanni Agnelli, took over in the 1940s. He was better known as Gianni Agnelli to distinguish him from his grandfather. And he took the investment side of things onto a bigger plane. Well, guess what? Gianni also jumped a generation as well. There was a bit of tragedy in the family with some deaths, but he basically chose his grandson, John Elkann, and the name Elkann comes because Gianni's daughter married Mr. Elkann. And unfortunately for the Agnellis, there's an ongoing feud between John and his mother about the inheritance, because John's built it spectacularly over a period of time since March 2009, where he's compounded the net asset value at close to 20% per annum between 2009 and the current day. And the reasons why he's been able to do that is one of the first key things is he's backed his winners. And the biggest winner that they've had is Ferrari, because Ferrari was separated from Fiat in 2015. It was spun off on the New York Stock Exchange at around about $52 a share. And if you followed it, it's very easy stock code to follow. It's RACE, R-A-C-E. The stock peaked out at nearly $500, so it went up tenfold, which for a seemingly conventional car company is pretty amazing. Of course, Ferrari is not a conventional car company. It's a luxury goods company that happens to have four wheels on it. So, it's really been grown. They've had an obsession about it. They only make 14,000 cars a year. I know you've got two, James, at 349,000 euros average price each. So, make sure your lovely partner gets to drive one now and again. The second thing about the company, which is called Exor, E-X-O-R, the company's listed on the Dutch Stock Exchange. The brilliant thing about Exor is that it has a lot of partnerships with other people. So it's not just all about Ferrari, though that is by far and away its most valuable asset. But they have a lot of unlisted assets where they're partnering with all kinds of really interesting and different people. One of the perhaps familiar names to people in the UK is James Anderson. He's a director of Heart of Midlothian Football Club, but he's better known for running one of the major Baillie Gifford trusts for a lengthy period of time. And they, of course, made a lot of money out of Tesla in particular. Yeah. So they've got a business with James and one or two others called Lingotto, which is it's a fund management business. I won't call it conventional, but it's fairly conventional. If you're interested in Berkshire Hathaway, you'll know they own a company called Precision Cutting Tools. That company was set up by the Wertheimer family and Ruthie Wertheimer, who sold the business to Warren Buffett. Exor are in business with her, and that's with well technology of all things. So the stuff that's in oil wells, the piping and stuff that goes down it. Um, they got into bed with Philips, the healthcare company, when Philips were in the poo a few years ago, and they teamed up with management there, and they're the largest shareholder in what is still a public company. Um, they've got partnerships in insurance. They've got other partnerships with the family that was one of the original people involved in Sanofi, the French pharmaceutical company. That's the Mérieux family. And so they have a 10% shareholding, the sole outside shareholding in a company called Institute Mérieux, which is not listed, but it basically is mainly comprised of a listed company. So there's a big lesson for you there, which is if you're going to build a family office, you're probably not going to be able to do it on your own because you're probably not going to know a lot about everything. You may have a real specialty, and we're going to come back to that, but try and partner up with people. Try and get people to maybe work with you in some way or other, whether it's just having meetings with them regularly, or maybe even paying them a small stipend to be actually part of what you do. Um, what what Exor also do is they don't diversify too thinly. They make each position fairly meaningful. So, with Institute Mérieux, for example, it's worth well over €1 billion, on a company with a sort of €30 billion portfolio. So that's 3% plus of their portfolio. So it's really important that you don't diversify too thinly and that whatever positions you have, you follow closely. You potentially work with other people, but you make them meaningful. I see so many European holding companies where they've got sort of fractions of 1% in a real estate investment. It's going to have to be the best real estate investment ever created to make them any money. The final thing on the Agnellis is pretty obviously Ferrari, Philips Healthcare, the other companies that they span out of Fiat, like CNH, which is agricultural equipment, obviously the oil well business, which is called Welltech, Mérieux, which is diagnostic testing. These are global businesses. Okay, so you've got to think global. Okay, don't just think, and it's particularly relevant to, I think, American uh, watchers. The American market's been so fantastic over the last few years, and there's a temptation to just think, the world stops and starts in the US. Well, it doesn't. There's some amazing businesses elsewhere. One's not downplaying, obviously, the fact that the IT revolution has certainly been driven in the US, but there's lots of other ways to play that. They're usually much cheaper, and they're listed in places like Germany, SAP, most obviously, and people often poo-poo France. But don't forget, the world's largest manufacturer of airplanes is Airbus, which is headquartered in France. They have brilliant defence businesses as well. So, have a global view on life, have a global view about companies, and I've not even started to touch on, Asia, and other parts of Europe.
I think one of the really interesting things about that is the whole aspect of backing your winners, because I think that's one thing that a lot of investors really struggle with. They end up, because I think people are taught to kind of take
Yeah,
profits and take some risk off the table and all that kind of thing, whereas a family like Agnelli is looking at they're looking at the situation as kind of owners of businesses rather than owners of equity.
correct. That's so correct, James. Look, the Agnellis have taken a little bit of money off the table in Ferrari since it spun out. They actually sold a little block of shares about 4 months ago. But they've kept the core holding. They own 20% of the company and they control it because there are special voting shares, which of course they have. And so, and they've said categorically that, they're not going any lower. And that's been a big ask, don't forget, when you've had a car company that's gone up tenfold. And it's obviously because, the stock market and investors have reevaluated Ferrari and said, this is not a Porsche. It is something very special. Porsche make many, many more cars. So that's kind of attainable luxury, whereas, let's be blunt, Ferrari for the vast majority, the vast majority of people is an unattainable luxury unless you really make that money. And so it's kind of like a Hermes Birkin handbag, with wheels and a lot more expensive to boot. It's at that super luxury level.
Yeah.
So it's that reevaluation in a world where I think it's fairly clear, the rich continue to get much richer, and unfortunately, the poor don't.
Right, so that's the Agnelli family. So the next dynasty is the Dieterin family. And if you've ever broken your car
That's
windscreen,
right.
you've probably been one of their customers. And it struck me because my car's wife, my wife's my wife's car broke down last night, so we had to get the AA out. And I was thinking to myself, this is kind of something that you have to spend money on this. It's not an optional, and it's this aspect of I think one investor called them the inevitables, where you have no option but to spend money on these
Yeah.
things. So to own an asset like this, that you basically you've just got to spend money on it no matter what is quite appealing. So tell us about the Dieterin family.
The Dieterin family are basically into their seventh generation. They were founded in 1805 by Jean-Joseph Dieterin, and he was a coach builder, which is why the company has this natty little logo, which is it's a little coach, like the kind of coach that you see the king and queen ferried around in, down the mall and things like that. They diversified over time when automobiles came along. They used to actually construct Studebakers in Belgium. Since the Second World War, they've been the Volkswagen distributor in Belgium. They're really lucrative franchises because they control over a fifth of the Belgian car market through the various VW brands like VW and Audi and others. They used to control Avis Europe, so they got into car rental in the late 1950s. They've pretty much done everything there is to do with cars because they actually own one of the largest spare parts businesses in Europe called Parts Holding Europe, which is actually headquartered in France. They bought that in 2022. However, the absolute jewel in the crown of quote backing your winners is a company that none of you have ever heard of called Belron. Belron is one of these beautifully anonymous names. Belron stands for Bertie, B-E, L for Lubner, so Bertie Lubner, and his brother Ronnie Lubner, who are South Africans. And in 1999, they gave the opportunity. It was actually a stock market listed company in South Africa. The opportunity came up for Dieterin to buy controlling shareholding, which they did, but they did it in tandem with the Lubner family. And Ronnie's son, Gary, who lives in the UK, actually ran the company for over 20 years. So what does Belron own that you might have heard of? Well, if you live in the UK, it owns Auto Glass. If you live in the US, it owns Safe Light. If you live where I do in Australia, it owns Windscreens O'Brien. It is the world's largest vehicle glass repair and replacement business. And Daylight is second, third, fourth, and fifth. It's absolutely enormous. And what's been amazing about this is the cash flow that this company mints is unbelievable. And one of the reasons why is over the last few years, as you'd be aware, if you own a motor car, and particularly a more recent one, you've got stuff called advanced driver assist systems, which are basically projected or actually built into the windscreen. So if a little Leeds United hooligan throws a brick through your windscreen, it's not you
Quite
can't go
horrible.
to your local little garage and put a bit, you know, and put a bit of plate glass in it. That doesn't happen anymore. It's basically not just a sophisticated windscreen, but of course you've got to calibrate it. Otherwise the displays won't work properly. So that's kind of like if we price it in US dollars, it's about a sort of $400 job. So it's expensive, and so the margins on that have ramped up dramatically over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. So D'Ieteren now own 50% of Belron. They brought private equity in gradually over a period of time. And to give you an idea, the equity value of the business when they bought into it was about 340 million euros. And the most recent transaction between two non-associated shareholders basically is valued the equity at about 23 billion. So that's some kind of investment. So they've sold down a bit, but they've still got half of it. So the lesson there is obviously number one, stick with your winners. Number two, think global. This is a global business. It's basically pretty much the biggest player in every country it's involved in. And the only places where it's not are places like Japan. Thirdly, partner. These guys are partners with the Lubners. They work with them. They didn't work against them in any shape or form. Fourthly, diversify, but don't go too thin. Altogether, D'Ieteren has 5 businesses. So it has its 50% stake in Belron. It has Parts Holding Europe, which I explained. It has the D'Ieteren Auto, which is the VW franchise in Belgium. It has 40% of another company where it partners with a family. And it's one of the largest suppliers of spare parts for material handling. So if you have a forklift and it breaks down and you need spare parts to fix your forklift, then basically these guys, it's called TVH, they supply the parts for you. And it has a 5th business, which is a reminder to stay on the reservation. Which is when you've done everything there is to do about cars, and I'll call material handling related to cars in its own particular way. So when you've done everything to do with cars, it's entirely logical that you would run off and buy an upmarket stationery business. So these are the people that in 2016 paid 506 million euros to buy Moleskine. And if you find anybody in a Moleskine store, please ring me up, because there's few and far between. And so it was a really bad mistake. The company basically loses money, really. The D'Ieterens will tell you it doesn't. And I reckon, slightly cynically, the only reason they hang on to it is it's a constant reminder day in, day out not to do anything so stupid ever again. So diversify, but, try to do things that, you know what you're doing. And if you don't partner up with somebody, in Moleskine, they didn't partner up with anybody. They just bought it actually off the Italian Stock Exchange. So, really, really crazy. And it goes against everything else they've done where they're partnering up with people, by and large. They also do have a little property subsidiary, because obviously if you distribute cars, that goes with property and everything else. Now, the other thing about D'Ieteren, where there is a lesson, if you are looking at setting up a long-term family office, you may have, if you're older, you may have brothers, who are your kids' uncles or sisters, your kids' aunties. and what's their involvement going to be in this business, and you need to work that out and determine it. And what you had here, the Dieterens had two sort of streams of family, and the controlling Dieteren is now Nicolas Dieteren. He's in his early 50s. His cousin is called Olivier Perrier, mainly because Nicolas' father, so his auntie, Cataline, married Mr. Perrier. So she's called Cataline Perrier Dieteren. And they own 27% of the company, whereas Nicolas' strand of the family owned 33. Well, in 2024, the Perriers decided they wanted to gradually exit, and Nicolas, together with the board, engineered a transaction whereby they could be gotten out over a period of time, and that resulted in the company paying a very hefty special dividend to all of its shareholders. So they did look after the shareholders, apart from those who, like me, live in Australia, because we got taxed at 30% on the dividend. But that was a €74 dividend on a 200-ish euro stock price. So, if you're going to have a wider family involvement in this family company or family office, then you've got to make sure everybody knows they're in it for the long term. And obviously, the Perrier Dieterens have been in it for the long term, but you don't have arguments. You can't have arguments. You've got to fix things up and understand, what the real story is out of all this. And the Dieterens did that, I think, extremely well.
Mm. Yeah, it's an interesting point about kind of defining the different roles in the family structure. I mean, in your view, is it a good idea for people to set up one of these family constitutions once they do get to the point of managing, let's say, like a virtual family office?
I do, James. I think it's really important to understand what people's roles are and what they're not. If you've actually got family working on, let's just say you turn into an investment business. If you've got family working in it, that's actually really good. That's actually much better, because they're sort of owner employees, if I can put it that way. What's sometimes very difficult, and where you often get trouble, particularly as you go down through the generations, is where you get a whole bunch of family who just have a shareholding and nothing else. They don't have an involvement. They don't have a role. And so, they're forever looking to get more dividends, or they're forever looking to sell. They all want to sell at the wrong time and things like that. So you've got to find a way to make sure they don't do that. And that's probably best done through some sort of legal documentation if you're going to have people like that involved. To be blunt, my preference is that you don't have people like that involved. Obviously, if you've got young kids, well, they're going to be naturally of that, of that ilk. If people are there, maybe they should have some kind of role, even if it's just a non-executive director type role.
Mm. And so, is that kind of like is that a really big part of your research process when it comes to looking at these companies? Because, for instance, if you've got several family members who are kind of, they're really reliant on getting a huge dividend every year, and it's not necessarily the right thing for the business. It might be a better idea to reinvest those profits, for example. Is that kind of like a major thing that you look for? Like the roles of these various family members.
It certainly is, James. You've hit the nail on the head, because if you have a family that's kind of at odds with each other and a bit disorganised, then what that does is in a public company, it reflects on the capital management policies of that company. So that, for example, just to take up the point you've just made, they might distribute too much in the way of dividends. And again, if these are European families, often the withholding tax is quite significant if you depending on the structure that you're investing through. So that's no good if you're sat in a foreign jurisdiction. Also, it's no good because you don't get compounding. one of the aspects of actually being alongside a family, a multi-generational family, is they think long term. And so if you're thinking long term, you're getting if they're doing it well, then you're getting the benefit of compounding. And that's one of the things we extol to, our unit holders and potential unit holders is that whole thing, which is why we try not to turn over our portfolio very much, because of course the companies we're invested in, they're trying to make their investable assets compound as well. So that's really quite important. So in many cases, I actually prefer these companies don't distribute dividends; that they just continually reinvest the profits or the cash flow that they make, depending on the composition of the company. Whether it's just an investment holding company or whether it's actually got a 100% owned business turning out cash flow. So that is quite important to me. Yeah, that's an intrinsic part of the research we do before we really start pulling apart balance sheets and P&L statements and cash flows and everything else.
Does that also sort of raise questions when it comes to kind of like capital allocation? Because uh, given that a lot of these companies are conglomerates, there's a bit of an issue there, isn't there, as to
Yeah,
where the capital is allocated?
there is. Clearly what I want to see is if they have a business, in a conglomerate, not every business is going to go well all the time. That's obvious. And so, what you want to see is you want to see the controllers evaluate the businesses. If things are not going to turn around because there's been a structural change in the industry, whatever that structural change is, you'd rather see them liberate capital from that. And in many cases, if they're a conglomerate that's got one or two not so successful businesses, then the shares are likely to trade a very significant discount to what they might otherwise really be worth. And so what you want to see is that capital liberated and used to buy shares back, even if the company already the family already control the company. So it's just good capital allocation policy. And many of the companies that we're involved in, despite the controlling shareholders being a family, have got stock buyback programs, whether they're just sort of consistent, ongoing, smaller ones, or Exor, for example, the Agnelli family one. Exor have had, in the last 3 years, Exor have had 2 in the last 3 years, they've bought back 1 billion euros of stock. That's on a company with about a 30 billion euro asset base. Which obviously trades at a substantial discount to that. So that's really meaningful stock buybacks. It's not cementing the Agnelli / Alcan family control. It's just good capital management. So that's something we really, really look for. We have another company we own in Canada called EL Financial, which is a life insurance holding company controlled by the Jackman family in Toronto. They have less shares on issue than they did in 1971. So, you look at other companies who just expand the capital willy-nilly. These guys are some of the most parsimonious people you've ever seen. And in the case of the Dietrich family, by the way, I can't find the last share issue they had, in terms of actually issuing new shares in exchange for new capital. I literally cannot find the records that show that.
Always a good thing to see. So the next family is the
Yeah.
Morbear family. It's the final one on the list, and it's by far the most
Yeah.
glamorous of them all. So let's hear about the Morbear family.
Okay, the Morbear family, this is not an investment company. This is a real operating business. If you've ever bought Chanel No. 5 for your partner, then you've bought effectively something from the Morbear family's publicly listed company in France called Robertet, Robertet, because Robertet is basically one of its one of the world's largest natural providers of fragrances and flavors. Um, and they're headquartered in a little place called Grasse, Grasse, which is in Provence, which is, if you know anything about oleofaction, you will know is, basically the, world headquarters for smelly things. Um, and so the Maurbes have controlled Robertet since early in the 20th century. Robertet was founded in 1870, and it was actually bought very quickly by a guy called Paul Robertet. Now, there's a small little piece of trivia here. Paul Robertet is responsible for one of the great crimes of the 20th century. Particularly if you're an aficionado of something like me. Mr. Paul Robertet, who is the original owner of Robertet, he actually patented the first process to create instant coffee. So, so there you go. Everybody's got a dark shadow in their closet. So there you go. So really, since the 1920s, it's been controlled by the Maubert family. One of the Maubert family was actually one of the original founders. And what they do is they have what I can only describe as a searing focus on one word, and that word is natural. So they're all about natural flavors and fragrances, which means they source they source thousands of different raw materials, if you will, things like, sandalwood and stuff like that, but obviously much, much more obscure things. And of course, how do they do that? Well, they've got a partner. They've got to partner with the growers of this stuff. And the growers of this stuff are obviously in extremely exotic destinations because it doesn't grow in, it doesn't grow in Leeds, let's put it that way. So it grows on tropical islands and things like that. And so they've got to partner up with these people to tie up the supply, but obviously to tie it up on a fair basis. Okay, not on an unfair basis to the to the indigenous people that are supplying it to them. So what they do is they obviously then distill the fragrance or flavour from those many raw materials, and obviously they on-sell them in three areas. They either on-sell the distilled raw material itself, they on-sell the flavours, or they on-sell the fragrances. And as I said, the most famous one is that they provide the olfactory properties of Chanel No. 5, without which it wouldn't be Chanel No. 5. They are one of the reasons for the searing focus. Is bluntly, they are a pygmy in a land of giants. The market value of Robertet is about 1.7 billion euros, but there are three enormous companies in this space. There are two companies with market caps around about 18 billion euros if we convert them. The one in Europe is called DSM Firmenich, which is Firmenich is German and DSM is the Dutch state mines, as it was. So they're massive. The other one is much better known, which is IFF, International Flavors and Fragrances. They're based in the US, obviously. They've had a pretty bad run of it. They create a lot of synthetic fragrances, as you can imagine. And then there is the absolute big gorilla of them all, which is a Swiss company called Givaudan, which has got a market value of about 34 billion euros. So it's it's 20 times the size of Robertet. What was interesting is both Firmenich and Givaudan were both on the Robertet share register for quite a long period of time. In fact, Firmenich owned 22% of them until last year. And another great story here about if you're going to set up a family structure. The Maubert family basically worked with Firmenich to get them out. They wanted to sell. and so they sold half of their stake to the market in general, and they sold the other half to three strategic investors: the Peugeot family, another French investment company, and they bought some themselves. And they've also done buybacks to liberate capital for some of the wider members of the family. So they've been very smart about the way they do things. So, I think the lessons from the Mobert family, is very much, again, you've got to think global. When your exotic material comes from places most of us have never heard of, you've got to be a global player. Your customers are global. Your fragrance companies, obviously, many of them are in France, but your flavour companies are everywhere around the globe that you're supplying to. You've got a partner in both respects with your customers and with obviously the people that you're sourcing it from. And you do have to look after the family members that are not necessarily part of the business. But what you've also got to do is you've got to have a searing focus on what your core raison d'etre is. And the core raison d'etre of Robertet is basically to be the biggest and best and quality supplier of natural flavours and fragrances. If you don't believe me, go have a look at their website. It's one of the prettiest websites you'll ever see, for obvious reasons. So very easy to find.
I was interested to see that they appointed a non-family CEO in 2022, and I just wondered what
they did.
What that tells you about the whole family stewardship thing, but then also balancing that against getting outside help when needed, and then also kind of feeding that into poor millionaires. And not everybody is kind of cut out to be an investor. You might have come from a business background, doesn't necessarily make you a great investor. It's also a skill to be able to know when you need to kind of ask for help, when you do need it. And if you could just talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah, in 2022, the realistically the first ever non-Mobert became the CEO, Jerome Bruja, so that was a hell of a step, and it was just simply a function of the fact that it was felt there was no one within the family at that time, to really take over the mantle of CEO, and so rather than sort of have someone not really qualified to do it. Particularly when, as I say, you're living in this land of giants who are big, aggressive, and smart. Then that's very sensible. To relate it to our poor millionaires, I think the crucial thing is, if so many people, I mean, you might understand, the widget business or the digit business, whatever you grew your wealth with, and you understand that fantastically. Well, you can still make use of that knowledge, but it doesn't, as you rightly say, necessarily translate into investing. Investing often, people, the most frightening thing about investing to most people, particularly ones who've made perhaps a lot of money out of property, is the fact that when you're looking at publicly quoted equities, there's a price every day. And as I often say to people, do you think your mentality would be the same if I rocked up outside your house every day and gave you a price for your house? It wouldn't be. You'd be talking to your partner to sort of say, "Oh God, the house has gone down in price today, darling. Should we sell?" And things like that. And having publicly quoted prices, as we all well know, spooks investors. So many investors, sell at the bottom and buy at the top. I always use the analogy with people of toilet rolls. So many people want to buy toilet rolls when they're £10 each. Rather than buying a house full of them when they're 5 pence each. If they're 5 pence, it's really bad. No, it's not. It's brilliant. If they're £10, it's not good. So, it's really important, I think, to, get help, whether it's just with the psychology of it, if you're investing in publicly listed equities, or publicly listed trusts or whatever, get some help to get you through that if you feel that that's a bit too hard for you or you don't understand the evaluation process or whatever. And not just a financial advisor, because financial advisors in many cases look a little bit too broadly, but someone who's got a little bit more specialism, and you'd be really surprised how many people share their knowledge, and are willing to actually give you time, in exchange for sometimes a relatively small investment, because most really good investors actually love sharing their knowledge with other people, as has, the world's greatest investor over the last 50 years, very fully day in, day out, and, particularly with his annual reports, which he will write no more.
Mhm. So there's been a great wealth of insights and information there, Andrew. I'm just wondering what are the kind of, if you could distill this into this sort of standout takeaways from the perspective of an investor and a poor millionaire. How can people kind of adapt their behaviour to incorporate some of these learnings, but also kind of still accounting for their very different circumstances to obviously poor millionaires, not really sort of on the same
Yeah.
pegging as some of these families. So,
Gotcha. I think the first thing is, and I do see this amongst some of my cohort. Um, Keep networking. It's, I mean, when you worked and built up your business, you were probably networking all the time, whether you were selling or whatever it was, with other partners. And so many people retire and they stop doing that, which is ridiculous. Or they just network with their, particularly if they're male, and we do know there's a distinct difference between how males and females network. If they're male, they just stick to their mates, and that's not a network. That's not networking. Make sure you're networking with people that are much younger than you are. I don't mind telling you, I share one of the guys that I share an office with. I used to work with his dad, which is great, So, to me, it's really important to, inculcate, the knowledge of the generation below you, or if you're of such an age, two generations below you. It's really important. Otherwise it's not so much you miss technology, but you miss understanding how they think about the world. Focus where you've got some real knowledge. If you do have some very specific knowledge and real knowledge from the business that you ran, you can still use it. You don't have to re-establish your old family business once again, but it will certainly have some use for you, in certain other areas, and it may be worthwhile in establishing a smaller version of it, or mentoring other people and having a small shareholding, providing you're not disqualified through the sale. Uh, Thirdly, back your winners. Don't sell them too early. I can tell you, virtually every investment mistake I've made has been selling my winners too early. I mean, sure, I've had duds like everybody, but I distinctly remember the first time I left $100,000 on the table, and I can show you some companies that I sold very, very early on that have more than 100 bagged. In other words, gone up 100-fold, and I didn't participate in 99 times of that. So no, I'm not telling you which one it is, but anyway. Um, back your winners. If you're worried, just take a little bit off the top, but keep some kind of core. Do what Alcan did with Ferrari. Do what the Dietrins did with Belron. Um, as I say, try and partner, and if you need help with your investments, try and find somebody that can genuinely help you, not just a paid financial advisor, but someone outside of that knows a little bit about these things. There's things like investment clubs, for example. They're really useful, because you'll find somebody in the same boat as you, but they might have, you might have made your money out of property. They might made their money out of a manufacturing business, and you're going to learn. You're going to learn from each other. So go networking in places like that, and you might find somebody that you really, really want to partner with. Um, think global. Okay, people don't really look at. Well, they shouldn't really look at what their portfolio exposure by country is. They should look at what their portfolio exposure is by industry or broad industry group. It doesn't matter. If it's a tech company, um, what does it matter if it's in the US or it's in Germany or it's in Japan? If it's got the goods, it's got the goods, and if it's the right kind of price and the ownership's right, it doesn't matter where it is really. Um, Diversify, but not too thinly. If you have half of 1% of something in your portfolio, you know, it's got to go up an awful long way to be meaningful to you. So um, don't go mad at the other extent, obviously, but sort of start to think about what's the sensible lowest holding for you. So in my fund, our minimum holding is 2% of the fund. When we start, our maximum is 5. Okay, but our absolute minimum holding is 2, so that we don't get caught up with, messing around, analysing stuff that needs to do extremely well. In fairness, one of our best stocks started out at 2% because we thought it was a little bit risky, which turned out to be absolutely correct. It went up tenfold in less than 2 years, but there we go. We had to take money off the top even of a thing that started at 2. Don't go off the reservation. So remember the Dieterins and all their car expertise and then buying moleskin. Usually that involves the next door neighbour telling you he's got a really good investment idea that some mate of his told you about, and you put too much money in it. So don't go off the reservation. Stick to stuff you understand. If you don't understand it, don't invest in it. Okay. And then finally, get the company structure right. You don't want too many non-worker owners. You have to accept that your kids are going to fall into that category, certainly for a while. But if you're going to have outsiders, inverted commas, grown-up brothers, grown-up sisters, and cousins and things like that involved in a kind of family office structure, make sure they know what it means. Okay, it doesn't mean they can ring you up every week wanting to cash out and ring you up every week wanting to put new money in just because the market's gone up or down. Okay, they're basically long-term holdings, so really important to get that bit right.
Great, thanks for that, Andrew. It's such an interesting topic, the whole family dynasty thing, and I think a lot of these companies are overlooked because these families generally tend to keep a pretty low profile, or a lot of them do. And as good as this overview was, we've only just scratched the surface here. And the good news is that you do share some of your insights online, don't you, Andrew? So can you just tell us where listeners can find you online?
Absolutely. I publish a quarterly report for the E72 Dynasty Trust. It's a little bit different. I mean, obviously, we tell people, what our performance is and what our stock exposures are, and what helped us and what didn't. Bear in mind we're long-term thinkers, so we do publish that quarterly, but we're not really worried about what happens in a quarter. But what we also do, which I think is really relevant to the listeners, is we usually write about 1, 2, or usually at most 3 companies that fit the kind of descriptions and that are companies that we own in our portfolio, and go into a fair amount of detail about them, and that we make that open to everyone. So they can go to our website e72.com.au, and if they click on the tab that says Dynasty Trust and quarterly reports, you'll find all 11 of the reports that are there, because we're not quite 3 years old yet in this structure. We do a 1-pager each month just to explain the unit price, because we price the fund monthly. So obviously we've got to tell people what the unit price is, and that usually just gives a bit of guidance to our 10 largest holdings. But for a bit of in-depth detail and a bit of stuff that you might find of interest in learning, the quarterly reports are obviously a little bit better. So to give you an idea, in the September quarter of 2025, we wrote about Bolloré, the French conglomerate. We wrote about Exor, so the Agnellis, and we delved in a lot of detail, not into Ferrari or CNH or Fiat, it's actually Stellantis now, which are publicly listed, but we delved into their unlisted businesses, including things like The Economist, which they're the largest shareholder. And we also dealt with Swatch Group, who are the world's second largest watch company. They own 16 brands, one of which is obviously Swatch, but they also own Omega, Longines, Blancpain, Breguet, and some other more obscure brands. And explain the back history of them and how they got to where they got to. So, and there's, I hope, lessons in each of those, each of those companies.
Brilliant. Andrew, thanks so much. We better let you get some sleep now because I think it's pretty late over there. So yeah, thanks for your time, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, if anybody does want to contact me directly, I can't provide investment advice, obviously, because I probably won't be licensed to do so in your jurisdiction. But if you do want to contact me directly, then it's andrew.brown at east72.com.au. So andrew.brown at east72.com.au. And I'm obviously based in Sydney, Australia.
Brilliant. Cheers, Andrew. Thanks again to Andrew for his time today. If you enjoyed the pod, don't forget to give us a follow and a like. And thanks for listening, everyone.